My parents said, "It's just a child," when my son died, but demanded that I transfer my son's fund to finance my sister's wedding. The words hit me like physical blows as I sat in their pristine living room, surrounded by family photos that conspicuously excluded any images of Oliver, my 6-year-old son who had died 3 months earlier. "Amelia, you need to be practical about this," my mother, Patricia, said, with the tone she used when discussing household budgets or vacation plans. "Oliver doesn't need that money anymore, and Maya's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event that requires immediate financial attention." The fund she was referring to contained $47,000, money I'd been saving for Oliver's future medical treatments, special education programs, and the adaptive equipment he would have needed as his condition progressed. Spina bifida had made Oliver's life more challenging than other children's, but it had also made him more precious to me, more deserving of every resource I could provide. "That money was for Oliver's care," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the sound of my father, Robert, shuffling through wedding venue brochures on the coffee table between us. "It was specifically saved for his medical needs and future treatments." "But Oliver doesn't have medical needs anymore," Maya interjected from her position on the couch, her voice carrying the same casual dismissal she'd used when discussing expired coupons or outdated magazine subscriptions. "He's gone, Amelia. Keeping that money sitting in an account isn't going to bring him back." Maya was 28 to my 32, but she'd always been treated as the baby of the family whose needs took precedence over everyone else's concerns. Her upcoming wedding to David, a real estate developer from a wealthy family, had become the singular focus of our parents' attention and financial planning for the past year. The money could help Maya start her marriage on the right foot, Dad added, finally looking up from the brochures with the expression he wore when he was convinced he'd found a solution to a complex problem. "She and David want to have children soon, and a beautiful wedding will set the right tone for their future family." The irony of discussing Maya's future children while dismissing the memory of the child I'd already lost wasn't lost on me, though it seemed to escape my parents entirely. To them, Oliver had been an inconvenience, a source of medical bills and family scheduling complications, rather than a beloved grandson whose absence had left a hole in my heart that would never heal. "I'm not giving you Oliver's money for a wedding," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "That fund represents 5 years of savings for his care. It's all I have left of my plans for his future." "Your plans for his future?" Mom repeated, her eyebrows raising in the expression of incredulous concern she reserved for my most unreasonable requests. "Amelia, sweetheart, you need to accept reality. Oliver is gone, and holding on to money that was meant for him isn't healthy grieving. It's obsessive behavior that's preventing you from moving forward." The psychological diagnosis delivered with the authority of someone who'd never lost a child felt like salt poured into an open wound. My parents had spent the 3 months since Oliver's death treating my grief as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a legitimate response to devastating loss. "Besides," Maya added, apparently emboldened by our parents' support, "it's not like Oliver would have needed all that money anyway. His condition was getting worse, not better. You were probably going to spend it on treatments that wouldn't have worked." The casual cruelty of the statement, the suggestion that my son's life wasn't worth the medical interventions I'd been planning, left me speechless with rage and heartbreak. This was my family's idea of comfort and support during the worst period of my life. "Maya needs $50,000 for the venue deposit," Dad continued, apparently taking my silence as consideration of their proposal. "The country club has a waiting list, but they'll hold the date if we can provide payment by next Friday. So, you need Oliver's entire medical fund, plus $3,000 more," I said slowly, finally understanding the full scope of what they were asking. "We're not asking for charity," Mom clarified with the defensive tone she used when she wanted to reframe unreasonable requests as reasonable negotiations. "We're asking for family support during an important milestone. Maya would do the same for you if your situations were reversed. But our situations could never be reversed, because Maya's future happiness was seen as worthy of financial sacrifice, while my son's life had been seen as a burden to be endured. The fundamental difference in how our family valued different types of love and loss had never been more clear. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing up from the chair that suddenly felt like a trap designed to keep me captive during this surreal conversation. "Don't take too long," Maya called after me as I walked toward the door. "The venue coordinator needs an answer by Wednesday, and there are other couples waiting for our spot." As I drove home to the empty house where Oliver's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, I realized that my family's request wasn't really about money. It was about erasing the last evidence that my son had ever existed. Oliver had died on a Tuesday morning in March while I was at work, believing he was safely spending the day with his grandparents, who had volunteered to watch him during his spring break from the special needs program at his elementary school. The call came at 11:47 a.m. from my mother, her voice strangely calm as she delivered news that would shatter my world completely. "Amelia, there's been an accident," she'd said without preamble. "Oliver fell down the basement stairs at our house. The paramedics are here, but—" She paused, and in that silence, I knew my son was gone before she spoke the words. "He didn't survive the fall. I'm so sorry." I'd left my office at the marketing firm where I worked as a graphic designer, driving to my parents' house in a state of shock so complete that I later couldn't remember the journey. The scene that greeted me was chaos, wrapped in the sterile efficiency of emergency response, paramedics packing equipment, police officers taking statements, and my parents standing in their foyer looking shaken but oddly composed for people whose grandson had just died in their home. "What happened?" I'd asked, though my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's body. "How did Oliver fall down the stairs?" "He was playing," Dad had replied, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he adopted when delivering unpleasant news about property taxes or car repairs. "You know how active he could be despite his condition. We were in the kitchen making lunch, and he must have wandered downstairs by himself." But Oliver had never been particularly active due to his spina bifida. His mobility was limited, and he was cautious about stairs even with assistance. The idea that he would have attempted to navigate my parents' steep basement steps alone seemed completely out of character for a child who usually asked for help reaching items on low shelves. "Where were you when it happened?" I'd asked, looking between my parents for an explanation that would make sense of how my careful, dependent child had ended up alone near a dangerous staircase. "We were preparing lunch," Mom had repeated, her voice carrying a slight edge that suggested I was asking inappropriate questions at an inappropriate time. "Oliver said he wanted to look at the old toys we'd stored in the basement. We told him to wait for us to help him, but he must have gotten impatient. The old toy story had felt wrong immediately. Oliver had never shown interest in toys that were stored rather than readily accessible, and his physical limitations made independent exploration unlikely. But I'd been too devastated to press for details, too consumed with grief to question inconsistencies in their account. The funeral had been a small affair. Oliver's classmates from his special education program, a few neighbors who'd watched him grow up, my close friend Sarah, who'd been more supportive than my own family during his medical challenges. My parents had attended but had seemed more concerned with managing the logistics of the service than processing the loss of their grandson. "We should keep this simple," Mom had said when we'd met with the funeral director. "Oliver was just a child, so we don't need an elaborate ceremony. Something brief and dignified would be more appropriate. Just a child." The phrase had become their standard response to any expression of grief that lasted longer than they deemed acceptable. When I'd cried during the service, Mom had whispered that I was making a scene. When I'd asked the funeral director about memorial options, Dad had suggested that less is more for children's services. Even more hurtful had been their immediate focus on practical matters rather than emotional support. Within a week of the funeral, they'd been asking about Oliver's belongings, his bedroom furniture, and whether I planned to continue living in the house where so many sad memories had accumulated. "You're young, Amelia," Mom had said during one particularly painful conversation. "You have time to rebuild your life, and maybe even have more children with the right partner. Dwelling on this tragedy isn't going to help you move forward." The suggestion that Oliver was replaceable, that future children could somehow compensate for his loss, had revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood both grief and love. Oliver wasn't a failed first attempt that could be improved upon in subsequent tries. He was an irreplaceable individual whose absence had left me permanently changed. Maya had been even less supportive, treating Oliver's death as an unfortunate interruption to wedding planning, rather than a family tragedy requiring compassion and accommodation. "I know you're sad about Oliver," she'd said 2 weeks after the funeral, "but I really need you to focus on being my maid of honor. The bridal shower is in 6 weeks, and I need someone who can handle the planning details without getting emotional about everything." The expectation that I would transition from burying my child to organizing celebration events had been surreal, but I'd been too exhausted to argue. Grief had made me compliant in ways that my family had quickly learned to exploit. Now, 3 months later, they were demanding that I sacrifice the last tangible connection to Oliver's future for Maya's wedding expenses, treating my son's memorial fund as a family resource rather than sacred money that represented my hopes for his life. Maya's wedding planning had begun 18 months earlier, long before Oliver's death, but it had accelerated into manic intensity during the months when I should have been grieving and healing. Every conversation with my family inevitably circled back to venue selections, catering menus, and guest list decisions that required immediate attention and substantial financial investment. "I need you to understand how important this wedding is," Maya had said during our most recent planning session, spreading bridal magazines across my kitchen table while I sat numbly drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "David's family has connections throughout the city. This isn't just a wedding. It's a networking opportunity that could affect our entire future." David Rothschild came from old money, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, whose social connections opened doors that remained permanently closed to most people. Maya had met him at a charity gala where she'd been working as an event coordinator, and their relationship had quickly evolved from professional collaboration to romantic entanglement to engagement with the breathless speed of a fairy tale romance. "His mother has very specific expectations about wedding quality," Maya continued, apparently oblivious to how her words sounded to someone whose own child would never have a wedding or any other milestone celebration. "If we don't meet certain standards, it will reflect poorly on both of us within their social circle." The standards Maya was referencing required a budget that exceeded most people's annual salaries. The country club venue cost $30,000 for a single evening's rental. The catering package was $15,000 for dinner and cocktails. The flowers alone were budgeted at $8,000 for arrangements that would be discarded the following day. "Where is this money coming from?" I'd asked during an earlier conversation, when the financial scope of Maya's wedding had first become clear. "David's family is contributing," Maya had replied, though her tone suggested the topic made her uncomfortable. "And Mom and Dad are helping with some expenses. But there's still a gap that we need to cover if we want the wedding we've been planning." The gap, it turned out, was exactly the amount of money sitting in Oliver's medical fund. Money I'd been saving for 5 years, through careful budgeting, overtime work, and personal sacrifice to ensure my son would have access to whatever treatments and equipment might improve his quality of life. "I know Oliver's fund seems like a lot of money just sitting there," Maya had said during today's conversation about finances, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when making unreasonable requests. "But think of it as investing in family happiness instead of letting it remain unused." Unused. As if money saved for a child's medical care became worthless the moment the child died, rather than representing years of hope and planning and maternal love expressed through financial preparation. "Maya, that money was specifically saved for Oliver's treatments," I'd replied, trying to explain something that should have been obvious to anyone with basic emotional intelligence. "It represents 5 years of sacrifice and planning for his future." "But Oliver doesn't have a future," Maya had responded with the casual cruelty that had become her standard approach to discussing my son. "And I do. I'm asking you to help make my wedding perfect, because that's what family does for each other." What family does for each other. The phrase had become Maya's favorite manipulation tool, deployed whenever she wanted something that required other people's sacrifice for her benefit. She'd used it when asking me to plan her bridal shower 3 weeks after Oliver's funeral. She'd used it when requesting that I handle wedding invitation addressing because her hand cramping made calligraphy difficult. She'd used it when asking me to coordinate dress fittings for bridesmaids who were strangers to me, but essential to her social networking goals. "Besides," Maya had continued, apparently warming to her argument, "keeping that money separate feels almost superstitious, like you're maintaining a shrine to Oliver instead of moving forward with your life." The suggestion that honoring my son's memory was equivalent to unhealthy fixation had been particularly painful, coming from someone who'd spent the past year obsessing over flower arrangements and table linens with the dedication of a religious fanatic. "David and I want to start having children right after the honeymoon," Maya had added, playing what she clearly believed was her strongest card. "When our babies arrive, they'll be your nephews and nieces. Investing in our wedding is investing in the family's future generations." The implication that Maya's hypothetical future children were more valuable than my actual deceased child was breathtaking in its insensitivity, but it perfectly captured how my family had always valued potential happiness over current grief, future possibilities over present loss. "I need more time to think about this," I'd said, the same response I'd been giving for weeks whenever the fund was mentioned. "Time is exactly what we don't have," Maya had replied, gathering her bridal magazines with the efficiency of someone who'd made her point and expected compliance. "The venue needs payment by Friday, or we lose our date to another couple." As Maya had left my house, her arms full of wedding planning materials and her mind full of social ambitions, I'd realized that Oliver's death had become nothing more than a logistics problem to be solved in service of her celebration. The isolation had begun immediately after Oliver's funeral, when well-meaning friends and distant relatives had returned to their normal lives while expecting me to do the same. But it had intensified dramatically as my family's focus shifted entirely to Maya's wedding planning, leaving me to navigate the most devastating period of my life without any emotional support from the people who should have been my closest allies. My daily routine had become a careful dance around reminders of Oliver's absence. I'd wake up in the morning still expecting to hear his voice calling from his bedroom, still anticipating the need to prepare his specialized breakfast and organize his medications. The silence in my house was so complete, it felt like a physical presence, weighing on my chest and making it difficult to breathe normally. Work had become my refuge, the only place where people still treated me like a functioning adult, rather than a grief-stricken mother who needed to be managed and redirected toward more positive thoughts. My colleagues at the marketing firm had been kind, but respectful, offering condolences without demanding details and providing normal work assignments without treating me like I was fragile. "Take whatever time you need," my supervisor Jennifer had said, when I'd returned to work 2 weeks after the funeral. "We can adjust your deadlines and redistribute projects if you're not ready for full responsibilities." But I'd wanted full responsibilities. I'd wanted to lose myself in design projects and client presentations, to spend 8 hours a day thinking about brand strategies and marketing campaigns instead of playground equipment that would never be used, and birthday parties that would never be celebrated. The evenings were harder. Coming home to Oliver's empty bedroom, with his adaptive equipment still in place and his special education materials still organized on his desk, felt like walking into a museum dedicated to a life that had been cut short before reaching its potential. I'd tried grief counseling, attending sessions with Dr. Marcus Webb, a therapist who specialized in childhood loss and family trauma. But even those appointments had become complicated by my family's disapproval of what they considered excessive mourning. "Therapy is fine for a few weeks," Mom had said when I'd mentioned my counseling sessions. "But Amelia, at some point you need to accept that professional help can become a crutch that prevents natural healing." Natural healing, according to my family, meant redirecting my attention toward Maya's wedding preparations and accepting that Oliver's death was a sad but ultimately minor setback that shouldn't interfere with family celebrations and social obligations. Dr. Webb had helped me understand that my family's response wasn't typical or healthy, but understanding their dysfunction intellectually was different from protecting myself from its emotional impact practically. "Grief doesn't follow other people's timelines," Dr. Webb had explained during one of our sessions. "Your family's discomfort with your mourning process is about their own limitations, not about whether your grief is appropriate or excessive." But knowing that my family was wrong about grief didn't make their constant pressure to move on any less painful or exhausting. The worst moments came during family gatherings that had been disguised as support visits, but were actually wedding planning sessions where my presence was required, but my emotional state was treated as an inconvenience to be managed. "We're all here because we love you," Dad would say at the beginning of these gatherings, "but we also need to make some decisions about Maya's wedding timeline." The transition from expressions of concern for my well-being to discussions of floral arrangements and catering menus would happen so quickly that I'd feel dizzy trying to keep up with the emotional whiplash. Maya had been particularly skilled at manipulating these family meetings to her advantage, presenting wedding planning as therapeutic activity that would help me process my grief through engagement with positive family events. "Planning my wedding could be exactly what you need," she'd suggested during one particularly painful gathering. "It would give you something beautiful to focus on, instead of dwelling on sad memories." The suggestion that Oliver's memory was something I should stop dwelling on had been devastating, but the family's immediate agreement with Maya's assessment had been even worse. They'd all nodded approvingly, as if she'd offered brilliant insight into psychological healing, rather than revealing her complete lack of empathy for maternal grief. "Staying busy with family activities is much healthier than sitting alone in that house thinking about what happened," Mom had added, apparently convinced that Oliver's death was something I thought about by choice, rather than something that invaded my consciousness regardless of my efforts to distract myself. The pressure to participate in wedding planning while managing my grief had created a surreal existence where I was expected to research photographers and taste cake samples while privately struggling with insomnia, loss of appetite, and the kind of profound sadness that made simple tasks feel overwhelming. But the most isolating aspect of my family's behavior was their complete inability to acknowledge that Oliver had been a real person, whose loss required genuine mourning, rather than just an unfortunate event that had temporarily disrupted our family's social schedule. The fund I'd been building for Oliver hadn't been just money sitting in an account. It had been hope made tangible, love expressed through financial planning, and the concrete evidence of my commitment to giving my son every possible opportunity for the fullest life his condition would allow. The $47,000 represented 5 years of sacrifice, overtime work, and careful budgeting that had shaped every financial decision I'd made since his diagnosis. When Oliver was 18 months old and the doctors had confirmed that his spina bifida would require lifelong medical intervention, I'd opened the special savings account and committed to contributing $500 every month regardless of other financial pressures. Some months, that meant working freelance design projects in addition to my full-time job. Other months, it meant living on rice and pasta while directing money toward his future needs instead of my immediate comfort. The fund had specific purposes that I'd researched extensively with Oliver's medical team. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, his primary neurologist, had helped me understand that children with spina bifida often needed expensive equipment and treatments that weren't fully covered by insurance, especially as they grew and their needs became more complex. By the time Oliver reaches adolescence, Dr. Hernandez had explained during one of our planning sessions, he'll likely need a specialized wheelchair that can cost $15,000 to $20,000. Insurance will cover basic mobility equipment, but the advanced features that could significantly improve his independence and quality of life often require out-of-pocket payment. The wheelchair had been just one item on a long list of potential needs. Physical therapy beyond what insurance covered. Occupational therapy, to help him develop adaptive skills. Educational support for learning challenges that often accompanied his condition. Home modifications like ramps and accessible bathroom fixtures that would become necessary as he grew larger and his mobility needs changed. There are also experimental treatments and surgical interventions that show promise for children with spina bifida, Dr. Hernandez had continued. They're not covered by standard insurance because they're still being researched, but families who can afford to pay privately sometimes see significant improvements in their child's outcomes. The experimental treatments had been my secret hope, procedures being developed at research hospitals that might improve Oliver's mobility, reduce his need for pain management, or prevent some of the secondary complications that often developed in patients with his condition. The fund had been my way of ensuring that if revolutionary treatments became available, I wouldn't have to choose between my son's potential improvement and financial stability. But the money had also represented more immediate practical needs. Oliver's special education program required supplies and equipment that exceeded the school district's budget. His physical therapy sessions often included home exercise equipment that cost hundreds of dollars, but made significant differences in his daily comfort and ability. He's been responding so well to the new therapy protocols. His physical therapist, Susan Martinez, had told me during our last session before his death. With consistent treatment and the right equipment support, children with Oliver's type of spina bifida can achieve much higher levels of independence than previous generations. I'd been planning to use part of the fund that summer to install a therapeutic pool in our backyard, a small above-ground model that would allow Oliver to do water exercises that were impossible for him in traditional swimming pools. The pool would have cost $8,000 including installation and safety features, but Dr. Hernandez had been enthusiastic about the potential benefits for his muscle development and overall fitness. Water therapy could be transformative for Oliver, she'd said when I'd described my plans. The buoyancy support allows children with his condition to move in ways that aren't possible on land, which can lead to significant improvements in strength and coordination. The fund had also been my insurance against the unknown complications that could arise with Oliver's condition. Children with spina bifida sometimes developed hydrocephalus requiring brain surgery. They sometimes needed kidney interventions or orthopedic procedures to address bone and joint problems. Having money available meant that if Oliver faced medical emergencies, I could focus on his care rather than on financial logistics. Every dollar in that account had been saved with specific love and hope attached to it. The overtime shifts I'd worked to contribute extra money, the vacations I'd skipped to maintain regular deposits, the restaurant meals I'd foregone to keep more money available for Oliver's future needs. When my family demanded that I transfer the fund to pay for Maya's wedding, they were asking me to sacrifice not just money, but the concrete expression of every plan I'd made for Oliver's future, every hope I'd held for his potential improvement, every way I'd found to show love through financial preparation for his needs. That money represents Oliver's entire future, I'd tried to explain to my parents during our last conversation about the fund. Every dollar was saved specifically for his care and opportunities. But Oliver doesn't have a future, Maya had replied with her usual casual cruelty. And my wedding does. They couldn't understand that Oliver's future had been real to me until the moment he died, and that the money saved for that future was now sacred. The last tangible evidence that his life had mattered enough to plan for, to sacrifice for, to invest in with hope and determination. The cruel dismissal of Oliver's death and the demand for his fund wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime pattern of emotional neglect and financial exploitation that had defined my relationship with my parents since childhood. Maya had always been the golden child whose needs took precedence, while I'd been cast in the role of the responsible older daughter whose value lay in her ability to provide support and solve problems for others. Growing up, the dynamic had been subtle but consistent. When Maya wanted expensive dance lessons, I was expected to babysit neighborhood children to help fund them. When she needed a new car for her 16th birthday, I was asked to contribute my summer job earnings toward the down payment. When she wanted to attend an expensive private college, I was encouraged to choose a less costly state school, so more family resources could be directed toward her superior academic potential. Maya has such artistic gifts, Mom had explained when I'd questioned why my college preferences seemed less important than my sister's. We need to nurture her creative talents even if it requires some sacrifice from everyone else in the family. The sacrifices had always been expected from me, never from Maya herself. While I worked part-time jobs throughout high school and college, Maya had been protected from any financial responsibility so she could focus on developing her artistic abilities and social connections that would supposedly lead to greater success. The pattern had continued into our adult lives, with my stable job and reliable income making me the family's go-to source for emergency funds and financial assistance. When Dad's business had struggled during the recession, I'd loaned them $15,000 that was never repaid. When Maya had needed help with her rent during her artistic exploration phase, I'd covered her housing costs for 6 months while she decided whether to pursue photography or event planning. "You're so good with money management," Dad had always said when requesting financial help. "Maya is more creative than practical, so it makes sense for you to handle the financial support while she focuses on her artistic development." But when Oliver was born with spina bifida, requiring expensive medical care and specialized equipment, my family's response had been markedly different than their attitude toward Maya's needs. Instead of rallying to support me through a challenging situation, they'd treated Oliver's medical requirements as an inconvenience that reflected poorly on my life choices. "Maybe this is a sign that you should reconsider your priorities," Mom had suggested when Oliver was first diagnosed. Single motherhood is difficult enough without adding medical complications to the situation. And the implication that Oliver's condition was somehow my fault, or that his needs were excessive rather than legitimate, had established the tone for how my family would treat him throughout his short life. They'd seen him as a burden, rather than a beloved grandchild, a source of problems rather than joy. When I'd asked for help with Oliver's care during his frequent medical appointments, my parents had always been too busy with Maya's latest projects. When I'd needed emotional support during particularly difficult periods of his treatment, they'd suggested that I was being overly anxious about normal childhood medical issues. "All children get sick sometimes," Dad had said, when I'd tried to explain the seriousness of Oliver's condition. "You can't let yourself become one of those overprotective mothers who sees catastrophe in every minor medical situation." Oliver's spina bifida had required weekly physical therapy, monthly specialist appointments, daily medications, and constant vigilance for complications that could lead to emergency hospitalizations. But my family had consistently minimized both his needs and my efforts to meet them. The financial disparity had been particularly striking. While Maya's wedding planning had inspired enthusiastic family meetings and generous financial contributions, Oliver's medical expenses had been treated as my personal responsibility that shouldn't impact anyone else's budget or priorities. "We'd love to help more with Oliver's care," Mom had said, when I'd asked if they could contribute to his physical therapy costs, "but we're already helping Maya with her wedding deposits, and we can't stretch our resources to cover everything." Maya's wedding deposits had been voluntary investments in her happiness, while Oliver's medical care had been my obligation to handle independently. The difference in how they'd categorized these expenses had revealed their true priorities with painful clarity. Even more hurtful had been their complete lack of involvement in Oliver's daily life and development. While they'd attended every one of Maya's art gallery showings and event planning presentations, they'd missed most of Oliver's medical appointments and had never attended his special education program events. "We're not really comfortable in medical environments," Dad had explained when I'd asked why they never accompanied us to important doctor visits. "Hospitals and therapy centers make us anxious, and we don't want to interfere with your relationship with Oliver's care team." But they'd had no problem interfering with every aspect of Maya's wedding planning, offering opinions and financial support with enthusiasm they'd never shown for their grandson's needs. Now, demanding that I sacrifice Oliver's memorial fund for Maya's wedding expenses, they were asking me to participate in the same pattern of prioritizing her wants over everyone else's needs, even the memory of my deceased child. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a family dinner to celebrate Maya's engagement and support Amelia through her grief, but which had obviously been orchestrated as an intervention designed to pressure me into surrendering Oliver's fund. They'd invited me to their house on a Sunday evening, promising a quiet meal focused on family healing, but Maya had arrived with wedding planning materials, and both parents had come armed with financial arguments they'd clearly rehearsed. "Amelia, we need to address the elephant in the room," Dad had announced before we'd even finished our salads, his tone suggesting he was opening a business meeting rather than having a family conversation. "Maya's wedding is in 6 weeks, and we still haven't resolved the funding situation. The funding situation. As if my son's memorial fund was a minor logistical problem rather than sacred money that represented 5 years of maternal love and sacrifice. We've been more than patient with your grieving process," Mom added, her voice carrying the edge of frustration she used when she'd reached the end of her tolerance for inconvenient emotions. "But at some point, grief becomes selfishness if it prevents you from supporting family members who are still living and building their futures. Grief becomes selfishness." The words hit me like a slap, revealing how completely my family misunderstood both loss and love. To them, continuing to mourn my 6-year-old son 3 months after his death was evidence of excessive self-indulgence rather than natural maternal devastation. "Maya has been incredibly understanding about your situation," Dad continued, gesturing toward my sister, who was nodding sympathetically while simultaneously spreading venue floor plans across the dining room table. "She's delayed several wedding decisions to accommodate your emotional state, but she can't postpone her entire future indefinitely. Accommodate my emotional state. As if grief over losing a child was a mood disorder that could be managed through scheduling adjustments, rather than a life-altering trauma that would affect me permanently. The venue needs final payment by this Friday," Maya interjected, her voice taking on the urgent tone she used when discussing limited-time offers and exclusive opportunities. "If we don't secure the country club date, we'll have to settle for a much less prestigious location that won't make the right impression on David's family. Maya, I've already told you that I'm not comfortable using Oliver's fund for wedding expenses," I said, trying to maintain the calm tone Dr. Webb had suggested for family confrontations. "That money was saved specifically for his medical care, and it feels wrong to redirect it toward a celebration. But Oliver is dead," Maya replied, with the casual brutality that had become her signature response to any mention of my son. "Dead children don't need medical funds. Living sisters need wedding support." The stark cruelty of the statement, the reduction of my beloved child to a dead child who no longer deserved consideration, finally broke through the numbness that had protected me through months of family pressure and manipulation. "Oliver was your nephew," I said, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "He was a 6-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and adaptive swimming and the stories I read him every night. He's been dead for 3 months, and none of you have mentioned his name except to dismiss his memory. We're trying to help you move forward," Mom said, her tone suggesting that my emotional response was evidence of the psychological problems she'd been concerned about. "Dwelling on tragedy isn't healthy, Amelia. At some point you need to choose healing over wallowing. Wallowing. 3 months of grief over my child's death was wallowing, but 18 months of obsessive wedding planning was healthy family engagement. You want to know what's not healthy?" I stood up from the table, my hands shaking with rage that had been building for months, treating a child's death like a minor inconvenience, demanding that his mother fund a wedding with money saved for his medical care, calling maternal grief wallowing, while treating bridal anxiety as a family emergency. "Amelia, sit down," Dad said, with the authoritative tone he'd used when I was a teenager who'd broken curfew. "You're being dramatic and unreasonable. I'm being a mother who's trying to honor her son's memory while his own family treats him like he never existed." "But he doesn't exist anymore," Maya said, apparently confused by my emotional response to what she considered a simple statement of fact. "Oliver is gone, my wedding is happening, and you're choosing a dead child over a living sister." The phrase "choosing a dead child over a living sister" crystallized everything that was wrong with my family's understanding of love, loss, and loyalty. They saw Oliver's memory and Maya's wedding as competing priorities rather than understanding that honoring my son's memory shouldn't require sacrificing financial security he'd never use. "I'm not giving you Oliver's money," I said with finality that surprised even me. "Find another way to pay for your wedding, because I'm not funding it with my child's memorial fund." "Then you're not welcome at the wedding," Maya replied without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting for me to refuse so she could justify cutting me out entirely. "If you can't support my happiness, then you don't belong at my celebration." The ease with which she'd discarded me, her only sister, her son's only aunt, revealed that our relationship had always been transactional, based on my ability to provide financial and emotional support, rather than genuine familial affection. "Fine," I said, walking toward the door. "Have a beautiful wedding. I hope it's everything you dreamed of." As I left their house for what I knew would be the last time, I realized that losing my family felt like relief rather than additional grief. 2 weeks after I'd refused to fund Maya's wedding, my friend Sarah called with information that would change everything I thought I understood about Oliver's death and my family's reaction to it. Sarah worked as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in personal injury cases, and she'd been helping me understand the legal aspects of accessing Oliver's medical records for my own grieving process. "Amelia, I need to see you immediately," Sarah said, her voice tight with an urgency that made my stomach clench with dread. "I've been reviewing the police report from Oliver's accident, and there are things you need to know before you make any permanent decisions about your family relationships." We met at her office after hours, where she'd spread out documents that painted a very different picture of the day Oliver died than the version my parents had provided. The police report contained witness statements, photographs of the accident scene, and medical examiner findings that raised serious questions about the circumstances of my son's fall. "Amelia, the basement stairs where Oliver allegedly fell don't match the injuries he sustained," Sarah explained, showing me crime scene photos that were difficult to look at, but necessary to understand. The medical examiner noted that the pattern of trauma was inconsistent with a fall downstairs. According to the medical examiner's report, Oliver's injuries suggested he'd fallen from a much greater height than my parents' basement stairs could account for. The positioning of his body when paramedics arrived also didn't align with a fall downstairs. He'd been found at the bottom of the basement steps, but his injuries indicated he'd fallen straight down rather than tumbling downstairs. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. "The police interviewed your neighbors after the accident. Mrs. Peterson next door told investigators that she heard shouting from your parents' house approximately 20 minutes before the 911 call, followed by a loud bang that she described as sounding like something heavy falling." Mrs. Peterson's statement was particularly significant because it suggested that Oliver's fall hadn't been the immediate cause of the emergency call. If he'd fallen and died instantly, as my parents had claimed, there wouldn't have been a 20-minute gap between the accident and their call for help. "What does this mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand the implications of what Sarah was showing me. "It means the police had questions about your parents' account of what happened, but the investigation was closed quickly because they classified it as an accidental death in a family home. Without evidence of intentional harm, they didn't pursue the inconsistencies." Sarah showed me additional documents that revealed more disturbing information. The emergency room physician who'd examined Oliver had noted that some of his injuries appeared older than others, suggesting he'd been hurt multiple times before the fatal fall. These previous injuries had never been reported to medical authorities, and my parents had apparently told hospital staff that Oliver's condition made him prone to frequent falls and accidents. "Did you know that Oliver had been treated for injuries before the day he died?" Sarah asked gently. "No," I replied honestly. "Oliver was careful about his mobility because of his spina bifida. He rarely fell, and when he did, the injuries were minor. I would have known about any serious medical treatment. But according to the hospital records Sarah had obtained, Oliver had been brought to the emergency room twice in the 2 months before his death, both times by my parents, both times for injuries they'd claimed resulted from falls at their house while I was at work. The medical staff had noted that the injuries were severe enough to require monitoring, but my parents had signed discharge papers and taken Oliver home without involving me in the medical decisions. "They never told me about these hospital visits," I said, feeling sick, as I realized how much my parents had hidden from me. I would never have left Oliver with them if I'd known he was getting hurt at their house. Sarah's expression grew even more serious as she pulled out the final set of documents. "Amelia, there's something else. Your parents filed a homeowner's insurance claim the day after Oliver's death, seeking compensation for accident-related property damage in their basement. The insurance claim included photos of damage to their basement that wasn't visible in the police crime scene photos, new dents in the walls, broken items that hadn't been mentioned in any official reports, and water damage that suggested someone had cleaned up significant mess after Oliver's death, but before police had completed their investigation. Why would they file an insurance claim for property damage if Oliver just fell downstairs? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that my son's death hadn't been the simple accident my parents had described. "Because they needed to document damage that would support their story about what happened," Sarah replied. "The insurance claim was their way of creating evidence after the fact to match the account they'd given to police and paramedics." The pattern that emerged from the documents was horrifying. Oliver had been injured multiple times while in my parents' care. They'd hidden these incidents from me and from his regular medical team. And when the final incident resulted in his death, they'd attempted to cover up the circumstances by creating false evidence and providing misleading statements to investigators. "What do I do with this information?" I asked, overwhelmed by the revelation that my son's death hadn't been an accident and that my parents had been lying about the circumstances for months. "You decide whether you want to pursue justice for Oliver," Sarah replied. "The statute of limitations hasn't expired for wrongful death, and this evidence could support criminal charges if you're willing to take it to the authorities." As I sat in Sarah's office, surrounded by evidence that my parents had been responsible for my son's death and had covered it up, I finally understood why they'd been so eager to dismiss his memory and redirect my attention toward Maya's wedding. They weren't just being insensitive about my grief, they were trying to erase evidence of their crime. The confrontation with my parents took place in the same living room where they'd demanded Oliver's fund for Maya's wedding, but this time I arrived with Sarah, a digital recorder, and copies of all the evidence that exposed their lies about my son's death. They'd been expecting another emotional appeal about family loyalty, not a methodical presentation of criminal evidence that would destroy their lives. "We need to talk about what really happened to Oliver," I said without preamble, spreading the police reports and medical examiner findings across their coffee table. "And about why you've been lying to me for 3 months about the circumstances of his death." Dad's face went white as he recognized the official documents, while Mom immediately began the defensive deflection that had become her standard response to uncomfortable confrontations. "Amelia, I don't know what you think you've discovered," Mom said, her voice taking on the condescending tone she used when she wanted to dismiss my concerns without addressing them. "But conspiracy theories aren't going to help you process your grief in healthy ways." "Conspiracy theories?" I held up the medical examiner's report with its detailed analysis of Oliver's injuries. "Is it a conspiracy theory that Oliver's injuries weren't consistent with falling down your basement stairs? Is it a conspiracy theory that you took him to the emergency room twice before he died without telling me?" The mention of the hospital visits hit Dad like a physical blow. He sank into his chair with the expression of someone who'd been caught in a lie he'd never expected to be exposed. "Those hospital visits were minor," Dad said weakly. "Oliver had small accidents while playing, and we didn't want to worry you unnecessarily while you were dealing with work stress." "Small accidents that required emergency room treatment?" Sarah interjected, consulting the medical records. "Oliver had 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and bruising consistent with being struck rather than falling accidentally." Mom stood up and began pacing, her agitation increasing as she realized the scope of evidence we'd assembled. "Oliver was a clumsy child because of his condition," she said, her voice rising with defensive anger. "He fell frequently, and sometimes the falls were more serious than others." "Oliver wasn't clumsy," I replied firmly. "His spina bifida made him cautious about movement, not reckless." His physical therapist and doctors all noted that he was extremely careful about his mobility limitations. Sarah pulled out photographs from the insurance claim that showed the basement damage my parents had hidden from investigators. "Can you explain why you filed for property damage compensation the day after Oliver's death? What kind of fall downstairs causes wall damage and requires professional cleaning services?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, as my parents realized we knew about their attempt to cover up evidence. Dad's shoulders sagged with the weight of finally being confronted with proof of their deception. "It was an accident," Dad said quietly, his voice barely audible. "We never meant for Oliver to get hurt seriously. He was being difficult that day, refusing to listen, and I lost my temper." "You lost your temper with a 6-year-old child with spina bifida?" I could barely breathe as the truth began to emerge. "He was throwing a tantrum about wanting to go home," Mom added, apparently deciding that honesty was their only remaining option. "We'd been watching him for hours while you were at work, and he kept saying he missed you and wanted his mommy. It was exhausting." "So you hit him?" I grabbed his shoulders to make him stop crying, Dad continued, his voice thick with guilt he'd been carrying for months. "I shook him and told him to be quiet, but he kept screaming. When I let go, he stumbled backward and fell against the basement door. It flew open, and he fell down the stairs. But the medical examiner said his injuries weren't consistent with falling downstairs," Sarah pointed out, consulting her notes. "The trauma pattern suggested he fell from the top of your house, not down basement steps." Mom covered her face with her hands as she realized they'd been caught in another layer of deception. "The basement door leads to a landing with another staircase," she whispered. "When Oliver fell through the door, he went down the first set of stairs, then fell over the railing and dropped to the basement floor. It was much worse than we told anyone." The image of my small, disabled son falling 2 stories because my father had shaken him in anger was so horrifying that I felt physically sick. Oliver had died not from an accident, but from child abuse that had escalated into a fatal assault. "And then you covered it up," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You cleaned up the scene, filed false insurance claims, and lied to police about what happened." "We were terrified," Dad said, tears streaming down his face. "We knew we'd be charged with child abuse, maybe murder. We thought if we could make it look like an accident, we could avoid destroying the whole family." "So you decided to destroy me instead," I replied. "You let me believe my son died in an accident while you knew you'd killed him through abuse." The confession continued for another hour, as my parents revealed the full scope of their cover-up and their months of manipulation designed to prevent me from investigating Oliver's death too carefully. Demanding his fund for Maya's wedding hadn't just been cruel indifference. It had been a calculated attempt to erase the last evidence that Oliver had ever mattered to anyone. They'd been willing to sacrifice my grief, my financial security, and my relationship with my sister to protect themselves from consequences of killing my child. 6 months later, I stood in the courtroom where my father was being sentenced for involuntary manslaughter in Oliver's death, while my mother faced charges for conspiracy to obstruct justice and filing false insurance claims. The legal process had been grueling, but it had also been necessary, not just for Oliver's memory, but for my own ability to heal from both his loss and my family's betrayal. The evidence Sarah had helped me uncover had been overwhelming. The medical examiner's re-examination of Oliver's case had confirmed that his injuries were consistent with child abuse rather than accidental falls. The insurance fraud investigation had revealed additional evidence of cover-up activities. Most damning of all, the recorded confession my parents had made in their living room had provided prosecutors with direct admission of guilt. "Mr. Chen, you have been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Oliver Morrison," Judge Martinez announced, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority that would finally hold my parents accountable for their crimes. "While the court accepts that you did not intend to kill your grandson, your actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for his safety that resulted in his death." Dad was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Mom received 5 years for her role in the cover-up. The sentences felt inadequate for the magnitude of what they'd done, but they represented acknowledgement that Oliver's life had mattered, and that his death deserved justice. Maya had attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom with an expression of shock and disbelief that suggested she was still processing the revelation that our parents were criminals rather than the loving grandparents she'd imagined them to be. "I had no idea," she'd said to me outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "I knew they could be difficult and demanding, but I never imagined they were capable of hurting Oliver or covering up his death." Maya's wedding had been postponed indefinitely when the criminal investigation had become public, destroying her engagement to David, whose family couldn't tolerate the scandal of being associated with child killers. She'd lost not just her fiancé, but her entire social circle, as people who'd been eager to connect with the Rothschild family had quickly distanced themselves when the Chen name became associated with criminal charges. "I understand if you can't forgive me for demanding Oliver's fund," Maya continued, her voice small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "I was so focused on my wedding that I couldn't see how much you were suffering, and I said terrible things about Oliver's memory. The apology was more than I'd expected from someone who'd spent months treating my grief as an inconvenience to her social plans. But it was also insufficient to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship through years of her entitlement and my parents' favoritism. Maya, forgiveness isn't something I can offer right now," I replied honestly. "I need to focus on healing from losing Oliver and from learning that my parents were responsible for his death. I don't have emotional energy available for rebuilding family relationships." "What about the fund?" she asked. "Are you going to use it for Oliver's memorial or something like that?" The question revealed that Maya still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what that money represented. It wasn't just savings that could be redirected toward memorial purposes. It was the concrete expression of my hopes for Oliver's future, hopes that had been destroyed by our parents' violence. "I'm using the fund to establish a foundation that provides medical equipment and therapy support for children with spina bifida," I replied. "It's called the Oliver Morrison Foundation, and it will help other families access the kind of care I was planning to provide for my son." The foundation had been Dr. Webb's suggestion during one of our therapy sessions, focused on finding meaningful ways to honor Oliver's memory while addressing my own need for purpose after losing him. "Channeling your maternal energy toward helping other children with similar needs can be a way of keeping Oliver's spirit alive while building something positive from your grief," Dr. Webb had explained. The foundation work had indeed provided structure and meaning during the most difficult period of my life. Working with medical equipment suppliers, therapy centers, and families navigating the challenges of childhood disability had helped me feel connected to other parents who understood the depth of love required to advocate for children with special needs. 6 months after Oliver's death and my parents' conviction, I was finally able to visit his grave without feeling overwhelmed by rage and betrayal. The small headstone I'd chosen was engraved with his name, dates, and a simple inscription: beloved son who deserved better. He had deserved better. Better grandparents who would have protected rather than harmed him. A better family who would have honored his memory rather than trying to erase it. A better world where children with disabilities were cherished rather than seen as burdens to be managed. But most of all, he deserved more time to grow and learn and experience the joy that every child should have access to, regardless of their physical limitations. Standing beside his grave, I made a promise that his foundation would help other children have the opportunities he'd been denied, and that his memory would be preserved through acts of love rather than demands for money. Oliver Morrison had mattered. His life had meaning, and his death would not be forgotten or dismissed, no matter who found that inconvenient for their own plans.